Well, welcome to Good Business Pays TV, where we bring you news and views, if you like, from business leaders and from organizations. Today, we are lucky to have with us our latest non-executive director, Wilfred Emmanuel-Jones MBE, founder and CEO of The Black Farmer. What I wanted to start by is, obviously, you're running what for many small businesses will consider, to be quite a chunky business now. But obviously you started as a very small business. How did you get into this whole area of small business, and what's your backstory? How did you get into this business?
Well, I mean, I'm the sort of person that has always run my own business. I started off as a freelancer, and then my first business, in fact, was a business called Comms Plus, and that was a marketing agency, PR marketing agency. And that's where we started off. And that's when you got to make a decision about whether you become a sole trader, whether you have partnership, whether you become a limited company. And the advice at the time was to become a limited company, which has its advantages and disadvantages. And in order to grow, you really eventually need to become a limited company. But what I discovered is that when you're just starting and when you're a small company, actually, I'm trying to think of a nicer word to put, but I can't think of it. But the only thing I can come with is that you're shat on. It's pretty brutal. And I from my experience, that's why I want to get involved in this organization, because it's taken advantage of people unnecessarily. And it's a bit like, for me, it's a bit like having a child, an adult having a child, and then taking advantage and abusing it. That's what it felt like in the very early days, is that there needs to be some sort of protection to allow these businesses the best of possible opportunities to at least try and succeed. We know a lot of businesses don't actually make it past their first year, third year, 5 years. So it's tough enough. If then their demise is due to the fact that they're not getting paid properly, that is unacceptable in our sort of society. I think that one of the things that I've just realized doing business with European nations is that, who are part of the EU, they've now got in law that everybody has to be paid within 30 days. And so that is just something I discovered recently, that's recent European legislation means that whatever the size of the company, whatever it is, you have to pay within 30 days. Now, I think that would be a good step for us in this country. But I think that when you're a small business, you need to get paid even sooner. 30 days just isn't good enough. It's all about cash. And so I think that people getting paid within 14 days is what really should become the norm.
Do you think that 7 or 14 days should apply to bigger companies as well, i.e. a big company paying a big company, or just for small business?
No, what I think we need to do in this country is that we need to actually accept that in order to encourage more business, you have to look after your small companies, and therefore you have to have different rules for small companies. And I think small companies should be able to demonstrate that they actually are working with bigger companies should be able to demonstrate that they are working with smaller companies, and that they have special terms for smaller companies. I'd like to see some incentive for bigger companies to demonstrate that they have an X percentage of their supplier who are small companies, and they operate under certain rules that are different to when they're dealing with companies over a different size.
So as you've seen your company grow from being a very small one to not such a small one, what have been some of the biggest challenges that you've had to face, not just in the payments area, but that would be great to hear, but broader business challenges as you've grown?
Well, I think the biggest problem that you have is The larger companies want to work with large companies. They don't want to work with small companies because it's too much of a hassle. It's too much as a faff, and it becomes a bit of a closed shop. It's more of a closed shop than you would ever imagine. And I'll give you an example of that. You know, in this country, there are three big pork producers, and they dominate the chain, the food chain. They work with the supermarkets where the volume is, and what is left, i.e., the second tier manufacturers, that they get what is left over. And I think the only way that you are going to encourage new blood is where these smaller companies have a route to market. That's why I'm advocating that a company over a certain size, in order to get either a tax relief or a tax benefit, has to demonstrate they have X number of small companies on their books that equals a certain turnover, that then, and they pay them on the terms, on healthy terms, and they're helping these companies grow. They're nurturing them because these companies have they have a consistent route to market. They're having a consistent income. If we had that, I just think it would then help to sort of breed newer, more innovative companies, because otherwise they're just left scrabbling around as the bigger companies just swallow up more and more.
And quite often in Good Business Pays, we talk about slow payment and late payment as two separate issues. You know, if you're on 90-day terms, for example, that's a long time. You wouldn't go into a restaurant, have a meal, and then say, I'll come back in 3 months and pay you for the meal I've just had. So that's slow payment. Yeah. But also as dangerous, and maybe more dangerous, is if I've got a 90-day contract with you, on that 90 days, I expect the money to come in. If it's 91, I'm in trouble. Is there a difference for you in terms of thinking about slow and late payment? One's worse than the other, or both are the same?
Well, the worst one for us is slow payment. And I'll give you an example of that. So we're in very, very inflationary times at the moment, and we are getting price increases from our manufacturers. Our manufacturers will come to us and they'll give us a week's notice and say, right, I'm sorry, but the way things are, we have to put the prices up. We then go to, let's say, the supermarkets and say, look, you know, here's open books. We've just had this price increase. We need a price increase. And what they do, they all do it. So no, you've got to go to our processes. That's slowing it down. We've got to go through all of their reviews. So you're talking about weeks, months, more likely months before they then agree it. But then they will say, well, but then it's not due to start for another month later. So you, as a company, you had to start paying. But if you get it, the price increase, it could be some 2 or 3 months later. And that's a way of just slowing it down. And you, as a small business, have to take that hit. And you just get that is the biggest trick that they pay, even though everybody knows out there that there's massive inflation, but you end up having to carry the increase for months because the people who are due to pay, they don't.
And is that part of negotiation or an ongoing contracting process? What should actually happen? What should good look like?
I mean, what in normal times, you know, you work to a sort of contract that any price reviews are done on a quarterly basis. And then you will have enough time to be able to have discussions to say, look, the price of pork's going up or this going up. And so by the time we come to our next quarterly review, our prices are going to be going up. And so you have that time to negotiate. And hopefully by the time the new contract comes up, all that's agreed. Extraordinary times, what people are doing is trying to use that process that is no longer relevant, because when prices are changing at the rate that is changing at the moment, you don't have the time to be able to negotiate, because prices are just changing at such a fast rate. So you can see why lots of companies go bust in these sort of inflationary periods, because if you're waiting months to negotiate a new price, but you're having to pay out the price, you can see where the dilemma is. And what tends to happen, as far as the thing that I think is unfair, is that if a bigger business has an issue with prices, they go to the government They go to the government for support. It happens a lot in the food industry. There's been some crisis in some area of farming, and farmers are not getting paid money. So then the bigger companies, as a collective, will go and appeal to government. Government will help out, and then that keeps their businesses afloat. As a small business, you don't have that option. And I find it really, really frustrating that these big, large companies, whether that's the supermarkets themselves, whether it's the big manufacturers, go to government and says, actually, the situation is a bit different and we need your help, we need your support, and they get it. So they sort of realize that they're too big to fail, and therefore they have a lot more power in terms of getting help from the government. When it comes then to smaller businesses, we then don't get that help in return. And that's where the problem is.
We publish watch lists of late and slow payers twice a year now, and what I found is food and beverage sector is one of the worst in terms of being slowest and late at paying. I often talk about it as payment culture. What's the explanation as to why food and beverage should be so different than quite a lot of other sectors?
Well, the thing about the food sector is that it's high volume, low margin business. Everybody's working on low margins, and therefore holding on to the cash as long as possible is, the thing that's sort of built into their model. But what that does is that it kills off small companies, it kills off innovations, because the big boys could go hammer and tongue at each other. So, you'll read occasionally where, Tesco's will fall out with, I don't know, one of these big boys doing a big brand. And, they're both heavyweights slogging it out with each other, and they'll eventually come up with a compromise. But what has happened to the food industry is that over the last 30 years, what the supermarkets did is they got rid of brands. And that's why when you're going to most retailers, it's very, very much own label. And so what they do is they go and they have a contract with a manufacturer, or they have a contract with a farmer, and therefore it doesn't really give the customer much choice. You either go to one or five of the big supermarkets, and that's fundamentally where your choice is. And it's when you have smaller players that you get really good competition. But if they've got no route to market, there's nowhere for them to sort of compete. And so one of the things I'm advocating, I think there should be a law where the government says X percentage of the stuff that you actually sell in a supermarket needs to be locally produced. That would then bring about competition. But the fact that that doesn't exist, it means that they control the food chain. And therefore, if you're a small business, getting into supermarkets is totally impossible, because it's my story is pretty unique. Not many brands get an opportunity to get into the supermarkets, and so they're then stuck in the sort of independent sector. But what I'm saying is that if people understood the food chain in this country, they will then discover there's some pretty dodgy practices going on. And another example of that would be most of the food that we eat in this country are eaten outside of the home. Not, it's eaten outside of the home. And if the consumer understood, so when they're buying food from the supermarkets, they're quite demanding about animal welfare, how the food is produced. And so the supermarkets have to be really, really, really careful, because what they really care about is making sure they look after the consumer to the detriment of the supplier. The consumer is really important. And so part of what we've got to do is that we have to get the consumer on side that demands to the supermarkets, look, what we expect of you is that you do have more brands, that you do treat these people fairly, because your existence is down to us shopping with you. So what I think is that probably what we should be doing is not just appealing to the manufacturers or the big companies themselves, is appealing to the consumer. And the consumers would think it's only fair that you treat the smaller players right, because they're going and handing over this money to these big players, and they expect that the big players should be doing the right thing by smaller producers. So I think consumers is a really, really important thing. So my brand is where it is today because I got the consumer on side. I would not be listed in the supermarkets if I didn't understand the power is with the consumers.
Yeah, and I found that with CEOs of very large companies as well, is that they're so far away from the small business owner in terms of the day to day that then they're not sort of connected to the problems of a small business owner. So, I just think that we need to get the conversation away from the boardroom table and onto the kitchen table almost in terms of.
You see, I think the thing is this, is that most, I did a survey once and it says most people who go on and do MBAs never go on to run a business. And so they understand the theory of business, but they haven't really had the experience of running a business. Most CEOs, managing directors have never, they're managers. And that means they're just managing numbers. They're not managing people. When you're an entrepreneur, when you're a startup, it's emotional. It's emotional. It's about people. And it's about actually how do you steer a course through this emotions to figure out the ones that are going to go on and do phenomenally well, the ones that will fall by the wayside, and the ones that need a bit of support. Now, a computer cannot do that.
No.
And that's what I think a lot of these managers do. They type some numbers in and then decisions are made on that. And that's why I don't think that small businesses and entrepreneurs are served well, because the skills you need to be able to take a punt to those who is worth the risk, just putting numbers in ain't going to give you that information.
So, Wilfred, in closing, what do you think? And I guess two questions really linked. One is, why did you decide to get involved with Good Business Pays? And secondly, what do you think we should achieve together for small business owners?
Well, the reason I wanted to get involved in Good Business Pays is having experience as a small business, what it's like, having managed to survive it. I want to be there to really use my weight to try and hold these people into account, to try and push for change. And that no one could actually look at me and say, well, this guy has no authority to talk about that, because I've lived it, I've breathed it. My backstory is, a guy, how does a guy from, Windrush generation, Small Heath in Birmingham, from the power go in to run a, 10 million turnover pound company? Now, some of it has been unnecessarily hard, unnecessarily tough. There are masses of disadvantages that have not been necessary. And there's a lot more that I could have actually gone on and achieved, and still could go and achieve, if I had the basic support that these big corporates would get. If I could do anything to help that cause, I will go out of my way to do my best for it.